This is a presentation on Michael Kelly's article, Public Art Controversy, the Serra and Lynn Cases. In this article, Michael Kelly gives his take on the controversy that surrounded the Tilted Arc, which was a sculpture by Richard Serra. But before we go into this article, let's give some background on the Tilted Arc and the controversy that surrounded it. The Tilted Arc was a site-specific sculpture which was 12 feet tall and 120 feet wide. It was a steel wall which curved slightly and leaned forward. It was installed outside the government buildings in the Federal Plaza of New York in 1981. In Richard Serra's own words, he said he found a way to dislocate or alter the decorative function of the plaza and actively bring people into the sculpture's context. Richard Serra saw this plaza as merely something decorative, something for people to just walk through and kind of not pay much attention to other than maybe just some visual interest. And so he installs this huge steel wall to break up the visual and the actual foot traffic flow of the plaza, in which people effectively had to walk around the sculpture in order to get where they were going. It completely disrupted uh, everything about the foot traffic in the plaza, and this was intentional by on the part of Sarah. He wanted to disrupt the traffic. He wanted people to contend with his sculpture in this way and kind of break up their daily lives and force them to interact with his art. Just as some more background, I've included here a couple photographs of some of his other sculptures where you can really see that he wants the viewer to interact with the sculpture. It's not just something for you to step back and admire and tilt your head and look at it from different angles. You really need to walk in, around, through the sculpture. You could even say that the sculpture isn't really complete without people inside of it. It's almost like where sculpture meets architecture, where it can house people, it affects how people move and interact with the space where the sculpture is installed. And although much of the art world, revered Serra and accepted his work, the actual residents and the people who worked in and around the plaza did not appreciate how much this disrupted their daily lives. And I've included here a photograph of when it was being taken down. I assume they need very heavy machinery to take down this huge steel wall. And I also included here a couple of quotes from both sides that were taken from the actual uh, court case surrounding this sculpture. The first one is from Joseph Liebman. He's an attorney who works in one of the buildings that are adjacent to the plaza. And he says, whatever artistic value the art may have does not justify the disruption of the plaza and our lives. So he basically says he doesn't deny that this sculpture may have some artistic value. It might have a lot of artistic value, but it's just not enough value to justify how much it negatively affects the lives of the people who interact with the plaza. And him and the people on his side of the case were arguing that the sculpture should be relocated. They didn't want it to be destroyed, removed, or anything like that, just removed from there and relocated to somewhere else where it wouldn't affect people's lives in this way. And I've included here as kind of a representative for the art world, Frank Stella, who's a painter, and he spoke on in this case as well. And he said, satisfaction of dissenters is not a necessity. The continued cultural aspirations of the society are a necessity, as is the protection of these aspirations. So Stella here sees art as a positive contribution to culture and helps move culture forward, especially avant-garde art like this. And he thinks that we need to protect these aspirations at all costs, and that among the many, requirements of creating this type of art, the satisfaction of dissenters is not one of them. It's okay that there are people around the art who interact with it and are not satisfied by it. There's many examples of art that doesn't satisfy people and is nevertheless important art. And to look at where Richard Serra and his side of the case really laid most of their argument. It was around the topic of site specificity. So here's what Richard Serra had to say. He said, "When the government invited me to propose a sculpture for the plaza, it asked for a permanent site-specific sculpture. As the phrase implies, a site-specific sculpture is one that is conceived and created in relation to the particular conditions of a specific site, and only to those conditions. To remove tilted arc, therefore, would be to destroy it." So what Sarah's saying here is, because his sculpture was commissioned to be site specific and was intentioned as being site specific, when you remove this sculpture from its site, you're removing a crucial aspect of the sculpture and the way that we're supposed to look at it and interpret it and interact with it. And so to remove it would effectively be to destroy it, because you're taking such a big and important part out of the context of the sculpture. However, well, the much of the art world probably sided with Sarah. Here we introduce Michael Kelly. He teaches philosophy at UNC Charlotte, and he specializes in aesthetics in combination with critical theory, political theory, and ethics. And he kind of goes against what some of the art world thought of Sarah's sculpture and the controversy surrounding it. And he argues that the tilted arc is actually not site specific, so relocating it would actually not destroy the artwork. Before we move on to his argument, let's go over a summary of the arguments on both sides. So, the arguments of the public that interacted with the sculpture and who wanted it relocated, that argument boils down to it being unnecessarily disruptive to place this huge steel wall in the middle of their plaza. And Sarah entirely disregarded the livelihood of the public that was forced to interact with the sculpture, in their view, and so relocating the sculpture would respect the artist because it supposedly wouldn't destroy his work, and it would also respect the public and their daily lives. Now, on the other side, Richard Serra's argument was basically that removing this sculpture amounted to a violation of free speech. Because the tilted arc is a site specific sculpture that was commissioned and approved by a governmental agency, to remove it is to destroy it and violate Serra's rights to free speech. And this also sets a dangerous precedent for the censoring of inconvenient art. This basically says that this was a legally commissioned and legally approved piece of art, and therefore it amounts to Richard Serra expressing his free speech, and therefore removing it is essentially to violate his right to free speech. And it also sets a dangerous precedent for the censoring of inconvenient art, in that if this case was accepted, which it was, and the artwork was eventually removed, it could set a dangerous precedent, because now we have a case where, because an artwork was inconvenient to people, the art was censored. And moving forward, we can imagine many different cases where just because an artwork offends some people, they could take it to court and they could rule to censor that art because of the precedent set by this case. However, Kelly's objection says that the tilted arc is actually not site specific. I've included here some of his words. And he said, "To be public, art must be created with a recognition on the artist's part of the people who constitute the public of public art." He, meaning Sarah, defiantly did not recognize the public in any of these senses. So what he's saying here is that because the sculpture was on its face meant to disrupt the public's life and affect it negatively, making them walk greater distances, decreasing visibility, etc. Sarah did not consider what the public would think of the art, not only what they would think, but how it would affect their lives. So what Kelly is saying here is that this might not actually even be public art. It might just be Richard Serra's private artwork that he's displaying in a public setting. And then moving on, he says, while the redefinition of a space by a sculpture may be consistent with the idea of site specificity, it alone is not sufficient to make art site specific, for the sculpture in turn has to be shaped by this same space. And so what he's saying here is that the site where this sculpture was placed into does not seem to be affecting the shape, size, the nature, the materials, everything, all of the aspects that should be taken into consideration when creating the sculpture. The site did not actually influence those decisions. It seems that while Richard was trying to influence the site, it doesn't seem that he allowed the site to influence his artwork. And so now we ask ourselves, is the tilted arc site specific? And to do so, I kind of put together these quick like photoshops of the tilted arc being placed into the FIU campus and this other plaza in the design district, just to see if it has the same effect. If you can really tell that the piece was influenced by the site. And so before we do that, let's look at some words that Serra said about his sculpture. If you're conceiving a piece for a public space, a place that people walk through, one has to consider the traffic flow. And he wanted to dislocate or alter the decorative function of the plaza and actively bring people into the sculpture's context. So basically, what Kelly's going to say is that, for example, if we just take this sculpture and place it in other plazas, it seems to tick all of the boxes that Sarah wants to accomplish in that federal plaza in New York in other sites. So this kind of lends credence to Kelly's argument that the sculpture is actually not site specific. So Kelly says that he, meaning Sarah, wanted to challenge the tendency within architecture at the time to treat public sculpture as decoration. However, his claim about site specificity was rather a claim about the autonomy of sculpture vis-a-vis architecture. Though his claim is legitimate, it had little, if anything, to do with public art. In other words, there seems to be nothing in Tilted Arc which directly relates to the specific site it was placed into. Serra's claim about the role of sculpture in architecture may be valid, but it is in no way limited to the Federal Plaza in New York. The artwork seems to be able to function similarly in other sites. Finally, in summary, this was a brief summation of Kelly's argument. Serra neglected the public element of public art, and he failed to let this site shape his work in any significant way. Therefore, the work was not necessarily public and was not necessarily site specific, and so it would have been justified to relocate the artwork to a place that was less damaging to the community. Now, moving on, Kelly wants us to look at an example of good public art that is actually public and actually site specific, which is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. So here's why Kelly says that this actually works as a public art piece. First of all, it was designed with the public in mind. The design of this piece was chosen and construction was overseen by a committee of Vietnam veterans. And it's definitely site specific because it displays the names of veterans that were lost in the war on a mirrored surface that actually reflects what he says is two other memorials commemorating divisive wars in American history, which are the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. So the reason why this piece is actually public is because the design was actually chosen by a competition that a committee of Vietnam veterans created, where they invited artists to submit their designs for a memorial commemorating the veterans that were lost in the Vietnam War. They ultimately chose this design by Maya Lin, and it's definitely site specific because it's situated in a place where its site, the context in which it's in, informs the work and adds to its meaning. Having the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, monuments who reflect on the Civil War and the Revolutionary War and the founding of our country. This it's ultimately a memorial about the effects of war, how much war takes from us and our families, and how many people war kills, and having reflections of these other, heroic monuments definitely adds to our interpretation of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Ellen. And finally, I put in here three discussion questions. The first is tilted arc was placed in between governmental offices. This may have not influenced not only the artwork, but the art world's defense of it. So, could an argument for its preservation be made if the sculpture was placed in a community, residential, or educational area? So, in other words, it's very easy to see the art world and the government or corporations being at odds. It seems very easy to make an argument for the preservation of art in the face of these very like usually cold entities and cold institutions. But if this same piece was placed in somewhere where, maybe children were the ones who use it most often, where residents of a community needed to walk through this plaza to maybe get from grocery stores or their places of work to their own homes, or maybe even like the picture that was shown earlier in the middle of a college campus, where maybe you're a student trying to get to class and having the sculpture placed in front of you impedes your ability to get to class. You maybe get to class late because of this sculpture. I wonder if the art world could have defended the preservation of this sculpture in its specific site as easily if it was placed in one of these other areas. The second question is, should all public art be voted on by the community it will be housed in? Are there instances where public art should be commissioned and put in place in spite of a disapproving community? So it seems like the easy answer here would be no. The public art, like Kelly says, should keep the public in mind. And if the public really opposes the artwork, then it shouldn't be placed into there because it's disregarding the public's point of view and the public's role in the displaying and the consumption of this art. But I wonder something like maybe artists can get together and put, I don't know, like in a traditionally racist community can put artwork that is anti-racist even if the community doesn't want it there. Like, would that be a good thing? It seems maybe an argument could be made there. And lastly, one of the defenders of tilted arc, William Rubin, claimed that important monuments like the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty were generally rejected by the community at first. He argued that the consideration of whether or not to remove tilted arc should be deferred for at least 10 years to give the public the opportunity to catch up with the artwork. So is this a defensible position? And how can we tell when art is ahead of its time and when it's just plain wrong? I'm sure we've all had instances where maybe we watched a movie or looked at a piece of art when we were younger, and much later on in our lives, maybe we kind of hated it as a kid, but maybe now we have a new appreciation for it. We understand it. Life has changed us, has given us new perspective, and we can now understand why this art is so powerful and so great. But it seems difficult to say, okay, let's defer this for 10 years and completely disregard the lives and livelihoods and opinions of the public who's going to have to interact with this art for 10 years. So I'm not sure we can always just say, don't worry, trust me, this art is ahead of its time. It's just wait and you'll appreciate it one day. I think a lot of times it's very difficult to tell when this is the case and when it's just art that is now bad and will always be bad. So that's all. Thank you very much.